With this video, I try to provide you some guidance related to slides number 11, from 11 to 15. So I'm going to talk briefly about judicial interpretation of the European Convention on Human Rights, the general standard applied by the European Court, and then a little bit about the clash between the judicial interpretation of the European Convention and, on the other side, political rhetorics regarding state sovereignty. And also, I will discuss briefly the execution of judgments, sanctions delivered by the court, and how it's interconnected with this state sovereignty problem and approach of certain states, member states of the Council of Europe. So, starting up with this general test, human rights violation assessment test, I'm saying that it's a general test because it's not only applied by the European Court of Human Rights itself, it's applied by a number of constitutional courts and all kinds of institutions of the protection of human rights, both domestically and internationally. You might have heard about that. It's called generally the necessity proportionality test. Now, as you see on the respective slide, I think it's slide number 11, you see that there are 5 steps that compose this test. The first step is legality. So then the court is checking whether the domestic law, which provides for restriction of human rights for a certain aim, whether that domestic law is clearly accessible, so precise in its language, so the citizens do have the possibility to get to know those provisions, so they are basically or can be well aware of the domestic legal framework that is the basis of the restrictive measures. That's one thing. But the other thing is regarding legality is that the court is also assessing domestic law itself, whether its language is in compliance with the European Convention on Human Rights. That's the other aspect of legality. Now, the next step in this human rights violation assessment test is legitimate aim. So for the court to check out whether there was a legitimate aim behind the violation, the restriction of human rights. Human rights are not absolute, so of course the state can restrict them, but only if there is a justifiable reason. And those can be these legitimate aims behind the action, all kinds of public interests. So public health, right now it's pretty current with the coronavirus. Public health can be a very recurring point of reference for state authorities to restrict human rights, like prohibiting you to go to the streets and to declare curfew for the country. That's a restriction of our freedom of movement. But of course, there is a legitimate aim, namely public health, and to fight against the spread of the virus. So state must have a legitimate aim behind the restrictive measures. The measure itself must be suitable for the achievement of that legitimate goal. And the fourth step is to check out whether the measure was necessary. And the fifth step is to review whether the measure itself was proportionate compared to the legitimate aim. So basically, states should strive for the least restrictive measures possible in order to achieve that particular legitimate aim. Okay, so I put on the slides for you a specific case from the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights in order to illustrate how this test works in practice and in the case of a specific case. But we will come back to this test from time to time when assessing specific and discussing specific cases. So this is the Nahova versus Bulgaria case where the court delivered the judgment in 2005. And so the facts occurred and the case occurred in 1996. So you see the facts on the slide. Basically, there were 2 Bulgarian citizens who were conscripts, and they left the construction site where they were supposed to work. They left the site without permission, and they left to a relative of them, basically the grandmother of one of them. So they were unarmed. They had no criminal record before, just very minor cases of theft, but no violent crimes on their records. And they were unarmed. And so the military police got the instructions from above, from the superiors, that they should go to this relative, to her house, and to use all possible measures to arrest these guys. And basically what they did, that they went to the house, they started to chase the 2 guys, they started to run away, and these military police arrived with multiple people, with a jeep, absolutely armed, so kind of G.I. Joe outfit, and they started to chase these unarmed people. And then they shot in the air, they warned them that they should stop, otherwise they will shoot, and then they just shot them in the back. And both of them died. So obviously here, the violation of Article 2 of the European Convention about the right to life was violated, was restricted. And so the court had to go through these 5 steps. First, legality. What did the court say about legality? It said, while checking the Bulgarian law about this procedure of the military police, the court found that actually the law itself was very loose in language. So it was not sufficiently precise in the conditions, the preconditions of using weapons for the legitimate goal of arresting these people. And so there were no clear guidance about what makes it truly necessary to basically shoot the subject of the measures, the affected people. And so there was a problem with legality. And then the court went on, what about legitimate aim? Of course there was a legitimate aim to arrest people at large who left without permission, in this case the construction site, as conscripts. They violated the law, they were responsible for a crime, so obviously there is a legitimate aim to prevent their escape, to arrest them. But of course, if we look at especially to necessity and proportionality, then we see that the relevant circumstances here are multiple. So basically on the site itself, these 2 guys were unarmed. They were no threat to these military policemen, 4 of them arrived at the site. They had no violent criminal records, so it was not probable that they would use violence against these military police, and they just unarmed started to run away. I mean, if we have a professionally capable military police, then definitely they should have different alternative measures to arrest such guys, as opposed to shooting them in the back and causing their deaths. So the court found that these measures were unnecessary and definitely not proportionate with the legitimate goal of arresting these 2 people. So now you see how it works in a specific case. We will come back to repeatedly to this test in other specific cases. Now the court is invested with the power of providing official interpretation about the European Convention. So applying this task, but also applying other tools of legal interpretation. Basically, the court itself is the highest body at the international level to provide an official interpretation of about the European Convention. But the states can argue that, look, we ratified the European Convention. We undertook to respect and enforce the provisions of the Convention itself, but we did not sign up for following each and every general advice and recommendation of the court itself. And on the other hand, the court is using its judicial discretion. You see notions on the respective slides like teleological interpretation. So basically, considering the main purpose and objective of the treaty, the convention itself, which is ultimately the protection of human rights. Of course, there is evolutive interpretation that with the change of social circumstances, for example, the society's perception and state's perception with regard to gay marriage is changing, then obviously the notion of marriage and family under the understanding of the European Court will change following the changes in the society, in the social perception and customs. And then the court is always searching for a European consensus. What does that mean? It means that it's checking the practice of European states, the practice of member states of the Council of Europe. And if there is a general growing practice or interpretation of a certain provision of the European Convention, then the court's finding is impacted by that. Now, certain states argue that that violates their sovereignty. Judicial discretion is basically interfering into internal affairs of those states. Now, there are extreme states who are very strong in this kind of rhetorics, such as Russia, no surprise. For example, in Russia, from 2015, the state declared that the application and execution of the judgments of the European Court is not automatic. It should be in compliance with the Russian constitution itself. So basically, the Russian Constitutional Court was mandated with the right and the task of overruling the European Court's decisions if it sees that it's not in compliance with the European Convention itself. Now, you can have skepticism and doubts about that and criticism about that, keeping in mind the basic principle of the relationship between domestic law and international law. From your international studies, you know about that. Now, when it comes to states' concerns with regard to sovereignty, then what you see that the whole system is full of guarantees for ensuring state sovereignty. First, states are allowed to make reservations when they join into the European Convention. Second, the European Court is not to be seen as a court of fourth instance appeal. So when it comes to the facts of the case, the court is not reassessing the facts because the domestic courts are closer to the facts and they do have more capacity and more competence in assessing the facts. So in the majority of the cases, the European Court is not doing that. And its proceeding is not automatic. We will discuss more, or I will present you in more details that later on with regard to specific cases. So there is this principle of subsidiarity, and when there is no clear-cut European consensus about the interpretation of a certain provision of the European Convention, then the court will leave broad space for the state to decide what kind of approach she decides to follow. And so that is respected to a large extent by the court. That's called margin of appreciation. Now, if you think about sanctions and what kind of sanctions can be imposed by the court, obviously, one of the most specific sanctions is just satisfaction, so financial compensation to be paid to the victim of human rights violation, who was subject of the procedure. And states tend to pay this just satisfaction. So there are not major problems with that part of the story. States are, when it comes to individual measures, so let's say that a person is illegally detained and the court is obliging the state to release that person from the prison, then states tend to follow this obligation and tend to respect that obligation imposed on them by the court itself. However, when it comes to general measures, when the court is recommending to the states, apart from the specific case, subject of dispute, general measures for the future in order to remedy and prevent potential future human rights violations. So let's say prisons are extremely overcrowded in a certain given country. We will talk about that in the next, or I will talk to you about that or speak about that in the next video with regard to the pilot procedure. So then the court might suggest certain general measures in order to reduce the overcrowding in the prisons. And that's a general measure. Those can be a general measures, like let's say, don't apply pretrial detention to all the cases or to a large extent, but try to reduce pretrial detention, which can contribute to the reduction of overcrowding in prisons. Now, the application of these recommendations is problematic because states can debate that whether the court has the power to impose certain obligations on them in a general sense and not connected to the specific case that was brought in front of the court itself. And connected to that, last remark I want to make is that it's the most important executive body, the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe, who is responsible for the supervision of the execution of judgments in general, no matter what kind of sanction we are talking about. And you see a link on slide 15. Please go to that link and check out whichever country you wish to see how far they executed judgments delivered by the European Court as seen by the Committee of Ministers. On the slide itself, on slide 15, I indicated a couple of countries like Azerbaijan, Russia, or Hungary. And there you see SC as an abbreviation. I meant their cases submitted to the Committee of Ministers as to execution. And CC is closed cases. So you see the proportion between submitted cases on execution and closed cases. And if you go to the link, you can check out any country that you are interested in and to check how far they respect the court's judgments and how far they execute these judgments. And we will continue the discussion in the next video related to pilot procedures and pilot judgments.